All right, guys, welcome back to our lecture series. I'm Ted, your host, and for this lecture, we're going to wrap up our discussion on immigration or the new immigration that occurred between 1870 and 1920. Now, before we begin our lecture proper for today, I'd like to do a customary recap and just touch bases on what we discussed in our last lecture. So, in our last lecture, we discussed uh, the sort of initial phases of the initial phase of immigration, such as the motivations for some people. So we really don't know all the motivations, but we can we can confidently group them into being better economic opportunities and more freedoms. For example, at this time in the United States, there was no compulsory military service. There was no draft at this time. In many of the European nations, there was an automatic draft for military service, especially in Russia, especially in the German states. There was also a new freedom, guaranteed electoral participation. Universal white male suffrage had long been established in the United States since the age of Jackson. In many areas of Europe, the vote was still denied to large segments of society. In the United States, at this time, all you needed to do to vote in the United States was be a male. Particularly a white male. African American males were at this time, of course, being disenfranchised in the redeemed states, but in states like New York or Illinois, California, and so forth, African American was still afforded the right to vote. Um, Most of the Jim Crow voting blocks and so forth were aimed at were aimed towards African American populations still in the redeemed states. But it was very attractive, and it became increasingly more affordable as new technologies, new business models, and practices came into being. It became much more affordable for entire family units to migrate together, to immigrate together, and of course for seasonal workers and short or long-term workers who had no intention upon staying in the United States, but merely wanted to make as much money as they can before they were unable to work, before they had to hit retirement age, and go back home. So it became so immigration and traveling back and forth became much more fluid. And of course, for those who put down roots, they sort of branched out from this intense localism to this broader national identity, as being either Germans or Italians or Jews, based on their shared linguistic heritage, cultural traditions, religious traditions, and so forth. So with that being said, I'd like to dive right into our lecture proper for today, and we'll begin with talking about immigrant assimilation. Now, in our last lecture, we closed on some of the tough decisions that the immigrant communities had to make in order to acclimate to broader American and industrial society. Um, those compromises and concessions continued. Many had to make adaptations to their older traditions. And one thing that really strikes many people is St. Patrick's Day. St. Patrick's Day is a major immigrant adaptation to American society. There were no Irish parades on St. Patrick's Day in Ireland. There were no real major celebrations. St. Patrick's Day was a feast day. It was a day where you didn't have to work, and so forth. In Ireland, it was a day off. It was a holiday, a blue day, because the Irish immigrants were not, given because they were not given all those Saint days on, they sort of clustered around St. Patrick's Day, and they made St. Patrick's Day into what it is today. They pretty much invented that holiday, and particularly Irish immigrants in New York City. They invented the holiday as a way of reclaiming a saint day, as a way of one, affirming their cultural identity, but also striking back at the industrial labor system. Foods were another way. Staples in, let's say, Chinese cuisine aren't really staples in traditional Chinese cuisine. Dishes such as chop suey and orange chicken are not indigenous to China. They were created by Chinese immigrants in the United States. Orange chicken. There are some people who are older than orange chicken is, and of course, chop suey was an adaptation to existing Chinese culinary practices by immigrants in the 19th century. Um, and of course pizza. I think pizza is perhaps the biggest of the immigrant adaptations. It was developed by Italians in the United States and really just exported back later to Italy. But before Italian immigrants started making the pizza pies, their pies here, they weren't really making them back in Italy. Now, the relative success of assimilation led to the disbursement of migration or secondary migrations of immigrant families out of these ethnic ghettos by the third generation. The stories circulating in Europe and elsewhere were certainly embellished, but new economic opportunities were real and achievable for immigrant families and immigrant communities. Immigrants who achieved rag to riches stories like Andrew Carnegie had stated before were very rare, very rare, and the eventual destiny of the overwhelming bulk of these new immigrant families would be a move into the middle class. Now, there also exists controversies with immigration, and particularly with this immigrant success and the success at assimilating these immigrants. Many arguments were made then and now against the formulation or the formulated policies for what's termed Americanization. And particularly the Americanization policies of the 1870 to 1910. Now, the experience of the First World War is often cited as both a positive and a negative for the Americanization policies. When the United States first entered World War I, German was still spoken by nearly 4 million immigrants and older communities, particularly these older communities in New York and in Pennsylvania. Most German Americans abandoned the use of German in public and in their churches, has a sign of loyalty to the United States. They also refrained from celebrating German heritage parades, which were very common and really a large public affair before the American entry into World War I. Irish immigrants at this time wanted to abstain from helping Great Britain, who was then embroiled in the major Home Rule dispute with the Irish. The Irish openly displayed their antipathy for aid for Great Britain, and when we get into discussing World War I, we will see how Woodrow Wilson sort of danced around it and sort of rope-a-doped the Irish communities and the Irish politicians and the Irish backers for his policies and for his party. And again, Woodrow Wilson himself sort of factors into this immigration because his mother was an English immigrant. So again, it's and again, we will address this when we get to World War I. But these immigrant attitudes and these immigrant assimilations and the whole process of Americanization still has had its flaws then and it has its detractors now. And then schools, as mentioned before, played a great role in assimilating immigrant children. It introduced them, one, to English, but it also introduced them to new national heroes. The Italian students are coming in with their Italian national heroes, their folk heroes. The Germans are coming in with their folk heroes. Slavs coming in with their folk heroes. Greeks, Poles, Scandinavians, Irish, all coming in with these folk heroes. The immigrant children were introduced to new folk heroes, American folk heroes. Men such as George Washington, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, and even later on Theodore Roosevelt became were being framed as figures worthy of not only emulation but of praise. Different immigrant communities also developed differing styles of assimilation. Now, some preferred to focus on educational success and achieved what we call rapid upward mobility. And other immigrant communities favored having family members leave school early, particularly males, leave school early, get a job to help with the family's income, and then to get married young. Particularly a lot of female members of the family marrying young, going off and establishing families of their own. These were seen as communal ways of success. Another sort of another sort of development, unintentional development of all this immigration was ethnic groups displaying prejudice towards one another, and this is really, if you've ever seen the name of the movie escapes me, but it's a movie from the 1980s with James Woods and Robert De Niro, where they play characters who sort of showcase the lifestyle. So these immigrant boys, immigrant boys who sort of develop this gang culture, this immigrant gang culture. Not if you've ever seen the movie Gangs of New York, not so much Gangs of New York. This was really much more of adolescent sort of like outspurts of sporadic violence, nothing really major, but still pretty rampant. There were ganglands in the early 20th century in the major cities, particularly New York and Philadelphia, Boston, and so forth. Those Atlantic seaboard cities, but also in places like Chicago and Cleveland, Cincinnati, in the interior. And again, these ganglands, these immigrant boys, adolescent gang clubs, if you want to view it like that. They were mainly centered in these immigrant ghettos, and mainly tended to draw upon some sort of recent immigrants. Now, of all the 19th century immigrant groups, none were more fiercely discriminated against than the Chinese. The Chinese have been coming to the western states, namely California, since 1848, and were regularly employed by major industrialists. Men like Leland Stanford has often stated the Chinese played a crucial role in Leland Stanford's ability to break through the Sierra Nevadas and California, and to lay his track across the desert. Linking up at Promontory Point. Those Chinese immigrants faced fierce antagonism, and the antagonism erupted between them and the Chinese and every other ethnic group. And this was mainly because the Chinese were willing to work for much lower pay than either old stock Americans or these new immigrants themselves. And this led to the rise of what we call Chinese exclusionary sentiments. Early trade unions, for example, barred Chinese inclusion, and this wasn't rare. They barred African Americans and Hispanics, Mexicans and the Southwest African Americans in the wherever they were at, whether they were in the South or in the Midwest around the Great Lakes, or on the along the Atlantic seaboard, the northeastern Atlantic seaboard. They barred them from admission into their groups and into their unions. And the Chinese faced the exact same thing. In many ways, Chinese discrimination was comparable to discrimination and exclusionary practices in the redeemed South in California, and also in places like Texas and Arizona and so forth. The discrimination against Hispanic communities was very much similar and reminiscent to Jim Crow policies in general. Now, around 1910, jumping a bit ahead, around 1910, the melting pot outlook began to seriously waver among Americans. And the term melting pot itself comes from a 1910 play called The Melting Pot, that was written by a Jewish immigrant from Great Britain, Israel Zangwill. The play itself was a great success for the time. The term, on the other hand, is very misleading. Even it was misleading then, and it's misleading now. It is clear that some ethnic groups and immigrant groups contributed more to the shape and development of the culture of the United States than others. Many aspects of the culture in the United States can be traced back to Great Britain, Germany, and the culture created by African Americans. Now, the melting pot remains relevant in a historical sense because everybody had to conform to the shape, but as a whole, not everybody was melded, or not everybody was sort of the character and the nature of America doesn't really hold all of the unique ethnic and cultural aspects of these groups that came in. Many of these groups had to abandon. Many of these groups had to abandon their ancestral culture, their traditional culture, and embrace this sort of carte blanche American culture, retaining only either first names or family names, had any sort of indication that they of their cultural or ethnic identity. Now, as anti-immigrant sentiments rose, new arguments were formulated to stem the flow of immigration into the Republic. One argument was that new immigrants would bring in dangerous ideas, and this was directed at German and Russian immigrants in particular. They were targeted at the community that fostered the spread of anarchist ideas in the United States. Socialists at this time tended to be recent immigrants. And again, the Germans, the Russians, and Finnish immigrants, believe it or not, were targeted as being, anarchist and socialist agents. Religion was another argument that was used to either place controls or to bar continued immigration. And Roman Catholic immigrants, Polish, Southern Germans, Italians, Southeastern Europeans, they were seen as contributing to the decay of American values. There was an intense anti-Catholicism rhetoric in the United States. Anti-Catholicism was very strong in the United States. It is really it was really believed by many that it was impossible to be a good Roman Catholic and a good American. Though those two ideas were incompatible. They would argue that the United States was a republic and a democratic nation, while the Roman Catholic Church and Roman Catholicism as a whole was devoted to an absolute monarchy ruled over by an absolute monarch. The Bishop of Rome, or the Pope, demanded the complete and absolute obedience of all Roman Catholics. Anti-Catholics argued that you could not be in favor of a republic and democracy if you're willing to accept rule or follow the obeys of an absolute monarch. That was a major argument, and again, this argument will flare up again in 1932 and again in 1960 during the presidential elections, where Roman Catholic candidates were viewed with suspicion because of these ideas on Roman Catholicism. And also, when we look at Woodrow Wilson's presidency and in the World War I years, when we see that rise in the new Ku Klux Klan, this new Ku Klux Klan activity, again, they will also express this very open anti-Catholic attitude. Now, anti-immigrant groups, or nativist groups, that they we tend to call them, they also took the view that immigrants really were the wretches of the world. They drifted towards, and they began to promote the idea of eugenics. And eugenics is the idea that you can lend a hand to evolution by helping to generate or promote the generation of a higher quality population. This was to be done by encouraging the reproduction of fit communities and fit individuals like old stock Americans, North Germans, Scandinavians, and of course the British, while discouraging the reproduction of the mentally inferior and lesser ethnic groups. Those would be African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, the Italians, Southeastern Europeans, and so forth. Southern and Eastern Europeans. They were who the lesser stock ethnic groups were sort of defined as or termed as. Now, this anti-immigrant movement came complete with literature, and particularly Stephen Jay Gould's book, The Mismeasure of Man, explores the application of intelligence tests to prove that Anglo-Saxons were genetically superior and intellectually superior to other ethnic groups. His research actually showed that the tests were culturally biased against groups. It showed that the tests were really engineered to calibrate the intelligence that of the immigrants, but based on calibrating the intelligence based on facts or information that only long-term residents of the United States could have access to. They were in other ways, in other words, biased in that there was no way the immigrant, unless the immigrant lived and breathed and only imported American foods, only imported American newspapers, was the only way the immigrant could pass the test was if the immigrant was completely immersed in American culture and American life. For rural immigrants, many of whom couldn't read in their native languages, let alone read in English, this was not going to be this was not going to be something that they could adapt to, that they could reasonably respond to. Nonetheless, these anti-immigrant groups were successful in getting Congress to pass legislation in 1920 and in 1921 to restrict immigration, and further laws were passed in the 1920s that made it increasingly difficult for immigrants to come to the United States unless they were coming from Northern Europe or Great Britain. And of course, Madison Grant's his book, published in 1916, The Passing of the Great Race, largely echoes the anti-immigrant group's views. And if you really want to know exactly what this anti-immigrant group, this anti-immigrant sentiment was all about, you have to read The Passing of the Great Race, or at least scan through it, because it really articulates their stances, and their stances at this point became the dominant stance. And really, the gist of everything was that the scrub races of Europe were contaminating the United States. So again, it's a very negative outlook on it, but he articulated it well enough to where the majority of the people at the time backed it. Now, all of these factors came together in accelerating the breakup of the immigrant ethnic enclaves. Their ethnic identities became weaker and weaker until it fell apart. The assimilation of the immigrants has actually served as one of the greatest, or in many ways, the chief success of the United States. Now, it cannot be overstated or simplified that bringing in so many people from such varied ethnic and cultural backgrounds was a monumental accomplishment in and of itself. Peoples who elsewhere in the world would have been acrimonious towards one another were brought in and largely lived harmonious. The gang life, of course, the gangland culture of the adolescent boys, taken as well, that they largely lived harmoniously with one another, and they largely fell into place in the American society and American culture together. The United States certainly had a very checkered past when it comes to racial and ethnic antagonism, but there were no mass campaigns of violence against these new immigrants. There wasn't a lynching campaign. There wasn't a denial of civil rights campaign. For the most part, these immigrant communities largely fell into place and largely thrived in the Republic. All right, and that's our that'll bring me to an end. That's my conclusion on immigration. I hope you guys liked it. Hope you found it enlightening, entertaining, and of course informative. Hit like, subscribe, and comment. Let me know what you thought about this lecture. And as always, I'm Ted, and I will see you guys next time for another lecture.